President and CEO of the Center for Effective Government in Washington, D.C. Ms. McFate has extensive experience working to improve social, economic, and governmental policy, including philanthropic positions at the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation. At the Center for Effective Government, Ms. McFate leads the center in its mission to build an open and accountable government that invests in the common good and advances the priorities of an active and informed citizenry. Today's printed program includes the full description of Katherine McFate's illustrious career. We are extremely proud to have her here with us today. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to today's keynote speaker, Ms. Katherine McFate.
Thank you. So some of you may know the organization as it was formerly known as OMB Watch. So if you come out of environmental issues, you may have noticed from that, and we changed the name to Center for Effective Government this January. But we're primarily known as an open government group. So I deliberately being provocative in the title of my talk today and the comments that I want to make here. We actually do a lot of work in environmental right to know, fracking, toxic chemicals. I co-chair with Rob Weissman and Public Citizen, 140 organizational coalition called the Coalition for Sensible Safeguards that's defending the regulatory system from attacks from the House that started in 2010 and continue like every couple of weeks. There's either some anti-regulatory bill that has to do with environmental issues or changing the process to make it harder to get new rules and regulations through. So while I was looking at your schedule and who you have here, I thought, what do I have to add to this? And instead of going toe-to-toe or going over some of the issues that are already being discussed at these panels, I thought, let me try to go up instead of going deep. Also because it's more fun this way. Washington, D.C., as you may know, has about this much space of what's allowed to be talked about, what's considered politically possible in Washington these days. So I want to talk bigger and try to encourage you all to think broadly. I think it's important to do this occasionally because when you start embedding where we are or talking about where we are in the context of a larger political narrative, it can sometimes free you up to have a broader conversation, especially when we're stuck, and I think sometimes in some of these conversations we're having, we are a little stuck. Looking at a much longer horizon increases my optimism. I think if you look from where we were 100, 200 years ago to where we are now, then you actually can see that arc bending towards justice, which is always nice. And I think sometimes when we get so stuck in where the case law is, where established law is, in the immediate circumstances of where we are, we forget to look up and think about what our broader goals are. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm guessing most of you in this room, not all of you, but most of you in this room, would agree with me that we believe that any information collected by government officials, when you're collecting information, there's a strong presumption that that information should be available to the public unless officials can provide a clear and compelling reason why they can't or why it shouldn't be, or whether there's some kind of individual privacy concerns that are in effect. Any information collected by government officials should be available to the public. It's a really radical idea. I think we're so used to it, we don't understand how radical it is. And it's not a very old one. So I'm going to walk you down my little personal history and remind you that liberal democracies and this notion of access to information is really only a few hundred years old. I want to muse a little bit about the relationship between information, citizens, and the state, and how that evolved over time. So before we had democracies, of course there was no citizen, there was just a subject. The Crown had absolute authority to gather information about its subjects, and it needed to because it wanted to extract value, taxes, revenue from them. When you have an absolute ruler, essentially the subjects have the right to use land, to operate trade, to have a license to sell, in return for some portion of the proceeds, and for the Crown to get what it wants it has to have accurate information about what's being produced. So from the earliest days, when we have a centralized state authority, we have a struggle over what information must be disclosed to what authorities. You can go back and you can look at peasants and landlord, peasants and tax collectors. Anytime that there's a rebellion, when they feel like people are getting too voracious with their goods, what's the first thing they do? They go burn down the tax office. They burn down the information, because if the state is blind, then they can't extract from them. And of course, as society became more complex, there's more taxable items. You can tax the number of buildings on an estate. You can tax the number of windows in a house. You can tax the quality of the roof on that house. But all of it requires good information for maximum extraction. But we also have the state getting involved with giving concessions, so giving out some of its authority. Control over the tolls and the royal roads, the proceeds for some Madeira wine that gets imported. For the ability of the vassals to accumulate, they have to also verify information. And as long ago as 1600, we started creating corporate charters, privileges granted to a group of investors, originally for some kind of public purpose, but with limited liability. So charters outlined what kinds of profits would go to the state and what would go to investors. But with these kinds of concessions, with these charters, now we have a three-way set of struggle over the information. So we've got the state, we've got some kind of folks who are involved as agents, and then we've got subjects or the people. And if the agents get too rapacious, voracious, then they might, again, face some kind of rebellion from the subjects, or the state might take it back. So everything's in a constant state of negotiation over who gets to extract and what information they need to do that. I think our present-day Tea Partiers in Washington maybe forgot that the original Tea Party in Boston was an action against monopoly control of the tea trade by the East India Company. This was a corporate entity chartered by the Crown. But it was about costs and extractions because of that monopoly, they could charge more. Now, I'm finally getting into where we are now, into American democracy. The radical notion of our democracy was that one of the most radical notions was that only elected representatives, that appointment of property, get to decide what rents get extracted by the authorities. So they get to decide what information they need about who's producing what, and push out and grab that information from citizens now instead of subjects. So, in the early colonies, they taxed what they could see. Most of our extraction came from tariffs, agricultural products brought in. And it's interesting that the Fourth Amendment about search and seizure was included in the Constitution because the colonialists objected to the fact that royal tax collectors could legally enter their houses and search for goods of contraband. So again, all of this is about arbitrary authority to tax, to extract. Americans are very sensitive about the ability of the state and agents to extract value from citizens, taxes, very, very sensitive about taxes, but they're also sensitive about individuals and companies who are able to extract higher prices for goods because they have some kind of monopoly control of land, access to water, access to timber. So in the early days of the Republic, individual states retained the right to give out those charters, and there were lots of provisions included that limited the ability of these private corporations to amass power. They set limits on corporate borrowing, on ownership, and they often had clauses so they could revoke the charters. By 1800, there were only 200 corporate charters that had been granted in the United States. And again, a lot of the states, they could revoke them, change them if they wanted to. The Civil War changed everything. The Civil War changed everything because when you scale up to do a war of that size and that consequence for the country, you have provisioning, contracting, ammunitions. You're dealing with a high concentration of wealth and accumulated concentration of manufacturing power. So then we get into Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, used to work, and new monopolies of the staples of the Industrial Revolution. I remember reading a book about Rockefeller, and he talked about in the last quarter of the 19th century, cooperative capitalism. That's what they call the trust. It was very secretive. They did not share what their business practices were, and actually went after journalists who tried to report about how they were accumulating all this wealth. That was the time, if you recall, of Pinkertons and private armies that were breaking strikers. And it was a time of immense corruption. This was when they changed the laws of incorporation. They limited political control. They limited the liability of owners, managers. They basically, the state stopped paying attention or stopped trying to regulate what was going on with corporations during that period at the end of, after the Civil War. The robber barons was the way everyone else saw them. We had much concentrated power, and the failure of the state to regulate allowed bigger fortunes than we'd ever seen before. But there was a pushback. So we have three different groups of people pushing back at the end of the 19th century, wanting to regulate that power again. The populists. They were very concerned about the way that, about shipping for their crops, about forward, the commodity exchanges, usury laws. They were fighting against the railroads. We had union membership. Between 1897 and 1904, union membership rose from about 500,000 to over 2 million. At that point in time, there were 2 million accidents, industrial accidents a year, and over 35,000 deaths a year. So you can see why the unions were active and organized. So you had agrarian folks out in the Midwest and the West with the populists, and even some of the South. You had urban workers who were fighting back against this concentration of power. And then you had the progressive movement, which were the educated urban folks between 1900 and 1915. Of course, this is when we had our first regulations of health and safety. We had the Meat Inspection Act in 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906, mine safety. I think that it was the progressives that got us focused in this, we need information, that's the most important thing that we have, that's how we're going to get industrial hygiene, that's how we can start regulating some of these concentrations of power. The populists and the unions wanted the problems fixed. The educated urban progressives wanted information that they thought would help people fix it themselves. I think that's an interesting distinction that I'll go back to. Are we actually trying to prohibit certain kinds of activities and make sure they don't happen, or are we going to focus more on gathering information and then figuring out those are unsafe, using the public to do muckraking and expose unsafe working conditions, and then hope that you'll get some regulations coming out of that? It might be a two-step process. But this is when we got it started, our regulatory state. Then we go back to the New Deal when everything fell apart in the wake of the Great Depression. And the New Deal really gave us lots of regulatory power that was about really stopping bad things from happening. During this time, we had the FCC, the FTC, Glass-Steagall, another Pure Food and Drug Act, 1938, coal mine safety, food additives later on in the 50s. And I think here we have this distinction between products, which we did quite well. If there was a product that we wanted to regulate, we would say we prohibit it, or it has to be safe, has to look like this. Not so well with the processes of the workplace, not so well with making sure that even though we were supposed to be doing health and safety, the enforcements weren't very good. They're still not very good. And we hadn't started saying, what are the externalized toxins and problems with the workplace processes. We have the third phase then of regulation with the public interest period during the 1960s and 70s, where the focus really was on internalizing the costs of the industrial processes, as well as improving the safety of particular products with the FDA, with highway safety. But we, parallel to this, we're putting more emphasis on information with the Freedom of Information Act in 1966, with the Truth in Lending Act. Want to point out that the Truth in Lending Act in 1968 was asking again for disclosure. Previously to this, we had a lot of anti-usury laws. So we're seeing in the last 20, 30 years, in some cases, a swap out of something that was actually fixing the problem, prohibiting certain things, to saying, oh, we'll just give everybody information, and then they can figure out, and they can make the choices themselves about whether or not this works. We see this with the fair election campaigns, the disclosure in 1974. We see this with some pieces of the Clean Water Act. We've been tracking, there's been some new rules about water quality reports. If you get a water bill, and it used to be, until about 6 months ago, if you got a water bill, you would have something on the back of your bill that told you everything that was in your water. You couldn't read it. You can figure out what it was. We looked at a lot of these. We couldn't figure, and we never saw one where an average person who wasn't a scientist looking at what could read that water quality report. But by law, they had to send it to you. Now they've changed that, and it's just going to be online. And they don't even have to. I guess they do put the website in your bill. But who are the people who are most likely to have difficulties with water? People in urban areas who don't have access to internet, and people in rural areas who don't have access to internet. I don't know what that was. I'm going to ignore it. So we see this shift into doing disclosure. If you don't have disclosure that forces the disclosing parties to put that information in a way that has meaning and is accessible to average citizens, it doesn't get you where you want to go. I'll tell you, the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act in 1975 actually did, and the reason that it did is because you had a set of advocacy groups who took that and used it. I'm going to come back to that. So they took it, they used it, they displayed the data to show redlining, to show that the banks were not allowing mortgages to take, that they were not giving mortgages to places where there were low income and black folks. So you can use the disclosure if you've got people who are making a point of it, and if you have, I'm going to do my punchline now, and if you have a social movement that's pushing for that information and can take it and use it and push through reforms. If all you've got is information and you don't have active, mobilized citizens behind it, then it doesn't get you very far. I'll give you a couple of examples of that. I think TSCA, the Toxic Substance Control Act, 1976, you guys know about this? I don't know if you talked about it. At the time that was passed, there were 62,000 chemicals that were floating around in our environment in the U.S., and 60,000 of them were grandfathered out of ever being tested. Only 200 have been tested by the EPA so far, and only 5 in its 35-year history have been prohibited, and they just overturned the ban on asbestos in 1991. So this was an example where we were supposed to have disclosure about what was going on with these chemicals, and another case in point would be the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know that was passed in 1986. We actually, I know you've talked a little bit about the toxic release inventory. When 9/11 happened, they took off, EPA took the risk management plans that are supposed to take place around the toxic chemicals in people's communities off their site. We kept ours on. We had a big fight, OMB Watch at that point had a huge fight with them about whether we could keep it on or not. They decided not to sue us, so we kept it up, and we still have it up on a site called R2KNet. And people still come to us because they can't get it out of the EPA. It is available, but it's hard to find and it's hard to interpret. Even on our website, it's hard to interpret. So we have this problem when we're doing disclosure, that if simple disclosure, without having some kind of political movement or political groups or political folks who are pushing it, it's not going to get us to fixing the problems that we want to fix, which are having healthy and safer communities, healthy and safer workplaces, financial products that don't blow up on people, campaign finance contributions where people actually know that the people that they are voting for are being supported by certain interests that they might not appreciate or support them to do. So this is my point is that disclosure in and of itself doesn't get us to where we want to go. I want to talk about 3 examples of challenges, well actually I'll just do 2, of challenges that we've been dealing with recently. One is about fracking disclosure. I know you talked about fracking this morning. I do want to say a bit about, the reason that we have moved and having this fight at the state level is because in 2005 there was a 1,000-page energy bill that got pushed through Congress late in the night, and the Halliburton exemption, the Cheney rule, is what we're calling it. And there was a little clause in there that said that fracking was exempt from any federal oversight. And people didn't really know that that was there, or a lot of people didn't know it was there, until it was already passed and it was into law. And we can't undo it now, so any kind of regulation of fracking is going on at the state level. Now, we did a report on this last year about all the states that were attempting to regulate fracking, and because we thought, well, disclosure is good, and there are a lot of states that seem to be picking up and adopting rules around disclosure. But they don't seem like they're that good. They would do things like, if you actually want to make sure that you're going to protect the environment and the water supply before the fracking occurs, then you would want to test at the beginning, and you would want to make a permit contingent on making sure that the water was safe and that the chemicals that you're using would not pollute the environment that you're in, right? Well, they don't do that. They typically say 6 months after the well is built and you've already got a set sunk cost, then they'll do some testing to see what's going on with the water, or then they'll tell you what chemicals they're using to pump into the fracking and into that potentially goes into the water supply. I thought this was kind of weird, and it turns out that there was a big fight in Texas, and ALEC, you all know what ALEC is, the American Legislative Exchange Council. This is the group in Washington, D.C. that it's a very conservative group that pushes out conservative legislation to state legislatures across the country. It gets most of its funding by corporations, so it has a very pro-corporate legislative agenda. Well, it turns out that this big fight in Texas, and the compromise with the environmental groups was, instead of doing strong regulations of what was going on with water supply, what was going on with air, what you did with wastewater, they said they would disclose the chemicals, they would disclose it. And ALEC picked that up and started pushing that out to all the states as a way to say that you were doing something to regulate fracking, but not really pushing forward to putting in the safeguards and protections that you would want. So this is, again, an example where disclosure is put in place of actually fixing the problems that people have. The other piece of that legislation is there are huge carve-outs for confidential business information. And we're seeing that on a number of things that have to do with toxic chemicals and toxic products. Huge carve-outs for confidential business information so that companies and corporations don't have to report on what exactly it is that they're doing, and the potential toxicity of some of the processes that they're involved in. There's another huge secrecy challenge that anybody who's concerned with regulation, I'm assuming already knows about, but I'll push it out there because in this coalition that we're dealing with, where we've talked about it several times, and I think it feels so big and overwhelming that people aren't grabbing it the way we would like them to. There's a new trade agreement between the U.S. and the EU that's being negotiated now, and it is essentially about harmonizing regulations. And I think a lot of people think, oh, well, we don't have to pay attention to that because the EU has better regulations than we do. But there are some very nasty provisions in there, and we have very strong trade negotiators who are doing all of this behind closed doors. They are negotiating a right of action by multinational corporations to sue governments directly. Now, you know, typically in trade treaties, they have to get their government, like we have to get the U.S. government to sue Canada if they think that there's something that's hurting their particular company or their commerce. Now they're giving multinational, this treaty would potentially give corporations the right to directly sue governments and get them into billion-dollar lawsuits with very deep-pocketed law firms. That's problematic. There are issues around the precautionary principle. There are a set of issues about third-party oversight of the health and safety of corporations. A lot of issues are built into these trade agreements, all happening behind closed doors, and then fast-tracking them, this is the way we've done them in the past, through Congress before people understand everything that's in them. There's been some complaints by members of Congress because they don't even get access to this information. They have to go to reading rooms and read it there. They can't carry it around in them because they don't want them to give out the information to advocacy groups like ours. So we still have huge secrecy issues built in to these issues around disclosure, these issues about regulation, especially if people want to disclose instead of fix something. But I want to go back to this information and how we use information and why we need it, because it isn't simply about quality of life issues. There are also increasingly issues here about growing inequality and the way not delivering information, not disclosing, allows large corporations who already have concentrated power to further accumulate and concentrate that power. Let me give you an example. One of the things that we're doing, that the debates that we're having now in Washington, obviously, are about how we are going to pay for the kind of government we think we want. First is what kind of government we want, and then what do we want to pay for that. And we're not having conversations that we should be having, that I think we should be having conversations about where that revenue comes from. We have the lowest tax rates that we've had in 50 years. Corporations are paying a smaller percentage of the federal budget than they have for about 40 years. We are not having a conversation about how to raise revenues. We're having a conversation about how to cut. Part of the reason we're not is because we don't have access to all the corporate information that we would like to have. There's an ongoing battle over the state and whether we see government as a problem or government as the prize. Increasingly, we feel that if you get more information about corporate tax disclosure and make that available to the American public in a way that they can understand it, then there might be a possibility of thinking about how you can use disclosure to extract those resources from the top 0.01% that has been paying less and less and less. There are bills in Congress now about closing down overseas tax havens. There's the group that actually put the Mortgage Disclosure Act on and redlining on the map is now the National People's Action has a whole new campaign about corporate tax disclosure and trying to make that something that the American public across the country understands is an issue of their capacity to grow, their capacity to share the wealth in the country. There's another campaign called the Taxpayer Empowerment Agenda that's all about disclosing privatization deals. There's a lot of things that are going, there's a big push for privatization across the country now, and this is the pushback on that, saying if you actually get the information about the deal before the deal is made, most of them don't go through. And we need to make sure in a democracy, if you're going to be contracting out these services, you need to make sure that it's a good deal, and you need to make sure that everybody has the information they need to make those judgment calls. There's a third kind of distributional campaign that's going on now, and this is related to Char's thing, about clawbacks from bond deals that municipalities have made, oftentimes, or some kind of public-private partnership that they've made at the local level. They oftentimes make bad deals. You were talking about the corruption that happens with pay-to-play when the politicians are hitting up the bond, the investment bankers. The other side of that, which I think was probably something you skipped over in your presentation, the other side of that is when you have investment banks coming and making deals and saying, we're going to get you a 10 or 15% return, and the folks who are negotiating those deals on the public side of it don't really know what they're getting into, and get into horrible swaps and interest rate swaps and things like that. And there are a number of, there are campaigns now to try to go back and claw back that money, particularly in places that are like on the verge of being the next Detroit, because they're paying really high interest rates and they didn't know what they were getting into. So we've got three different ways that people are trying to use information to extract more revenues from these entities that have concentrated power in the United States now. We've done this before. We did this, we are now back to levels of inequality that we have not seen since the Gilded Era at the end of the 19th century. And we've got to figure out ways that we can pull down more of these resources and have so that we're able to move forward and grow together and have prosperity, that we broadly share prosperity instead of this growing apart. I think that we need to be thinking about how we can do this kind of disclosure as a necessary struggle for getting our democracy back to a place where we're really investing in the public structures that we know we all need to have the kind of society that we want to have. It's not going to happen unless we have broad-based support and we are pushing with a broad citizens movement in this country. And I think we're actually getting close to that it'll be 2 or 3 years from now, but you're going to see the same kind of we are seeing, we're doing lots of polling, we're seeing the same kind of frustration and feeling that the rules are rigged and something has to change for us to be able to have an America that we recognize for our kids in 20 years. And the millennials are quite an interesting group, and I know some of you are out here and you're feeling the frustration of entering the labor market in a very difficult time. The folks who are out in the field organizing are my heroes and my inspiration. And I'm trying to come back to this because I was at a wonderful event yesterday when folks were putting out a 40-year plan about how to shift the conversation and have a different conversation about how, instead of pulling apart and everybody trying to say, I just want to get my own, that they were saying, how do we figure out how we can strategically move forward and create a country that we all care about and all want to be part of. I'm going to end there. I would say, did any of you read Paul Krugman's article today? His op-ed page? He has a lovely piece talking about inequality and what's going on and the 0.1% of the folks, and kind of says, at the end of the day, these guys were irate about not getting bonuses or having their bonuses questioned, even though the folks from the bailout firms. And he's kind of like, at the end of the day, how many more houses do you need? How many more yachts? How many more cars? This is just about somehow feeling entitled, and we have to change that conversation. And I think we can. So, thanks.